Hello, this is episode 9 of New Uses for Old Circuits, Interference and Inversion. In the previous video, we looked at the al-Jabr patch, which is a patch that combines a lot of things we've been discussing on this channel so far. It consists of an audio feedback loop made up of nonlinear functions. And then it uses a control voltage to sketch out the chaotic terrain of that feedback path and have a cybernetic regulator try to regulate that control voltage so that whenever it approaches a point of instability, it tries to do a little balancing act. The term al-Jabr comes from the Abbasid mathematician al-Khwarizmi, who in the 9th century in Baghdad wrote the book on what we know of today as algebra. But in the title of his book, al-Jabr sat alongside another term which we're more familiar with today, al-Jabr, which is the basis of our term algebra. And where al-Jabr refers to the balancing that you do when you're trying to solve an algebraic equation, al-Jabr, which I believe is the Arabic term for something like reunite, refers to the grouping of like terms that you do when you're doing algebra, combining opposing terms and completing the equation. So in this video, we're going to look at this al-Jabr patch, which basically takes the same idea but has two major differences. One has to do with the cybernetic regulator. In the previous video, we used an envelope follower to do our regulation, to observe the system. And that works okay, but it mostly looks at the average level of the system. Now, in general, these systems are very noisy and very chaotic, so they're always pretty loud. So it might be better if we could refine that cybernetic regulator to look at something a little more particular, say the rate of change of the system. So for that, in this al-Jabr patch, we are going to compute the derivative of the system. And the second major difference is the way in which we're going to tame it. In the al-Jabr patch, we have a CV driving the system, so exploring that chaotic space, and the cybernetic regulator just pulls back on the CV itself when the envelope follower kicks in. In this al-Jabr patch, what we're going to do to tame the system is instead inject an inverted version of the audio directly into the feedback path, attempting to cause phase cancellations. It's been interesting to see in the comments section of these videos some of you perceive where we're going. I laid the groundwork for this part of the video in episode 3 of New Uses for Old Circuits called Sources of Inversion. Now that I claimed was the most boring synth YouTube video on the planet, and I don't think it's been surpassed yet. And all we did in that video was go through the surge and look for which modules invert the signal. That's going to be helpful to us now because we're going to see how that inversion of audio into the feedback path directly changes our results. And we're also going to jump back to the first video in the New Uses for Old Circuits series, which looked at slope generators and how to use them as low-pass filters. And we're going to see how we can use the slope generator as a low-pass filter and think about it more as a kind of moving average filter and use that to calculate the derivative of our audio signal and create a very different kind of cybernetic regulator. So this video is going to be a little less talking than usual because it's kind of mostly synthesizing a lot of things that we've talked about so far. And the end of this video is going to be a pretty long procession of different sounds that I'm getting from using this patch. As usual, I like to think of these patches as a kind of starting point, of the kind of basis of a patch, a guiding idea that you then can just build off of by introducing things into the audio path, playing around with the control path, and basically creating feedback loops all over the place. So later in the video, you'll hear me just kind of be quiet as I add new things in. Often when I'm adding things on to a patch that has a pretty coherent idea at its center, I'm not thinking too much necessarily about what's going on. I'm just kind of adding things that I think might make it more interesting, seeing what works, and then changing things around to try to get new sounds. So here we go. Let's jump into the al-Jabr patch. So to start patching the al-Jabr patch, we'll start with the same feedback loop we had before. We'll go from the bottom wave multipliers into the middle wave multipliers, and then the middle back down to the bottom, creating a feedback loop with two distinct nonlinearities. Right away, we're going to diverge a little bit though, because the main way that the Al-Jabr patch differs from the al-Muqabala patch has to do with the way we tame the audio signal, which is directly in the audio path itself. And the way we're going to do that is by using inversion. Let's incorporate the mixer into our feedback loop so that we can mix multiple signals together. So if we take a listen to this, we can hear our feedback patch. Now the key to the Al-Jabr patch is to use inversion to try and tame our audio here. So we will take our same audio output and put it into a second channel of the mixer, but the one that has the inversion switch. So if we just have it uninverted, let's listen. As we bring it up, we just kind of add more feedback to the loop. But as we invert the signal, we start to do some cancellation. Inverted. As you can tell by just us playing around with this is going to give us actually some pretty interesting results. If you were to do the same thing with, say, just a basic static sine wave, of course, when the signal is inverted and you're mixing the inverted version with the uninverted version, you're just going to get straight up phase cancellation and hear silence. But our feedback loop here is producing all sorts of really interesting chaotic sound. Within that sound, you have noisy components, and you also have patterns and steady frequencies that are repeating. If our feedback loop is exerting some kind of regularity, then the inverted version will be able to cancel it. But if we're in a purely noisy territory and the signal is moving around erratically, then the phase cancellation trick is not going to work as well. And also the strength of the inverted signal that we mix into the feedback loop is going to have a big difference as well. So let's send this through a VCA to control the amount of inversion. And I'm just going to use the active processor here. I'll take our feedback signal, go into input 2, and set the crossfader all the way to input 1. And our cybernetic regulator will come in here and crossfade to input 2 to act as a VCA. And so we'll just take the output here and go into our channel of the mixer. Before we add the cybernetic regulator, let's do what I always like to do, which is patch this whole sound through the res EQ because it sounds really great. Now what I do want to do is bring back our sort of driving voltage here to move the two knobs of our nonlinear function for us. So I'm just going to take those and go into the controlling the bias voltages of both parts of the wave multipliers so that we can get, so we have this sort of constant motion going on in the system. In the al-Muqabala patch, we used a slope generator, using it as an envelope follower, as our cybernetic regulator to monitor what's going on in the patch and regulate this driving control voltage. The thing about using an envelope follower, however, is that this is a really, really loud patch pretty much all of the time. If you look back to the first video in this series, slope generators as low-pass gates, you'll remember that that's basically just using the slope generator as a low-pass filter. So we were essentially running our feedback loop through a low-pass filter to make decisions on how to tame the system. Another way of looking at it is that this envelope follower, this slew generator, this low-pass filter, was taking a moving average of what's going on in the system. It's basically slewing out the very quick movements and noisy and chaotic things that are going on in our audio path and giving us kind of the average value over a bit of time determined by the setting of the fall parameter. To heap on even more mathematical analogies, what the slew generator is doing here is basically acting as an integrator. But whatever we call it, this envelope follower is basically just measuring the average level of audio in the feedback loop. But we know from experience that it's pretty loud pretty much all of the time. So what could be cool is instead of using the average energy in the feedback loop, we instead use its rate of change, its derivative. We'll calculate the derivative of our feedback loop, the rate of change going on in the system, in a pretty crude way. First, we'll run the signal through the peak processor, and then we'll do two things. We'll take the output of the peak and go into our CV processor, and we'll take a copy of the peak and go into our slope generator, configured as before as an envelope follower. And we'll take our envelope followed output and subtract it from our audio signal. So basically, the output of our CV processor here is taking the audio signal and subtracting from it our moving average of the audio signal. So this is more or less giving us the derivative of our audio. And just as integration in calculus is analogous to a low-pass filter, differentiation in calculus is analogous to a high-pass filter. Which kind of makes sense, right? We're taking our full audio signal and subtracting from it a low-pass version, so the result should leave us only with high-frequency components. Basically, we've set up a very crude high-pass filter using a crude low-pass filter and subtracting the low-pass filtered output from the original audio signal. Let's listen a bit to what is going on in this patch. And we can look at this derivative output. So now what we're going to do is use this derivative as our cybernetic regulator and use it to turn up the strength of our inverted signal into the feedback loop. So that basically injects this inversion every time the derivative, the rate of change, is really high. Let's add a phaser in for fun. And also add the spring reverb. I'll take one of the phaser outputs and go into the feedback loop. as with the al-Muqabala patch, the Al-Jabr patch really works as just kind of a basis for exploration. I've added a bunch of stuff here, some other function generators, some math, some processing of the driving voltage with the cybernetic regulators and putting them back in, adding some things to the audio path such as phasing, adding this phaser 720 degree output into our feedback path. Let's actually run that through a ring modulator. And what do we want to ring modulate it with? That cable's not long enough. What do we want to ring modulate this with? Well, let's just, of course, if we do it with a sine wave, we'll get something nice.